The darkened car window reflected the silhouette of a frail boy, a little over 10 years old, who was rubbing the cloth with determination, ignoring the biting cold of that morning. Ethan Caldwell watched, intrigued. Something about that boy caught his attention, and it wasn't just his tired appearance or worn-out clothes. There was something familiar in his features, in his deep eyes, and in the resolute way he cleaned every inch of the windshield. When the traffic light turned green, Ethan extended a $50 bill through the window. "Here, kid, take this." The boy looked at him and hesitated. Then he took a step back and shook his head. "No, I haven't finished cleaning yet." Ethan frowned, surprised. "What?" "I don't accept money for a job poorly done." The unexpected response brought a faint smile to Ethan's lips. He had never heard anything like it. Children in that situation usually accepted anything without question, but this boy had his own code of honor. He lowered his hand, still holding the bill. "What's your name?" "Lucas." The name echoed in Ethan's mind like a ghost from the past. A strange sensation ran down his spine. The boy's face, now more visible in the morning light, looked even more familiar. But it wasn't possible. Before he could ask anything, a female voice sounded from the sidewalk. "Lucas!" Ethan turned toward the voice and felt his world spin. There, standing a few meters away, was Rachel Miller. His heart nearly stopped. She saw him too. Panic crossed her face. For a moment, neither of them moved. Time froze. Rachel grabbed the boy's arm tightly. "We're leaving. Now." Lucas looked at his mother, confused, then at Ethan, who remained motionless, unable to process what was happening. "Mom, I haven't finished yet." "Now!" Rachel started pulling him across the street, her body tense like a wire about to snap. Ethan reacted too late. "Rachel, wait!" But she was already gone, disappearing into the crowd. Ethan stood in the middle of traffic, ignoring the honking and the irritated looks from the drivers behind him. His heart pounded erratically. Rachel Miller, the name he hadn't spoken in over 10 years. The name of the only woman he had ever truly loved, and who, without explanation, had vanished from his life. Now, she was there, with a boy who had his eyes. Ethan knew he needed answers, and this time, he wouldn't let Rachel run away. The rain pounded New York that night, but Ethan Caldwell didn't care. He was sitting in the office of his luxury apartment, an untouched glass of whiskey on the table, while his mind spun in a whirlwind of thoughts. Since the unexpected encounter with Rachel and Lucas, he hadn't been able to think about anything else. He opened a folder of documents on the table and picked up an old photo he had kept for years. It was a reminder of a time when he had been truly happy. In the image, he and Rachel were sitting on the sand of a beach in Montauk, laughing at each other, young and in love. What had happened to all of that? Why had she simply disappeared without explanation? And above all, was Lucas his son? The idea seemed absurd and at the same time made perfect sense. The boy didn't just look like him as a child. He had the same determined gaze. Ethan needed answers, and he knew exactly where to start. The next morning, Ethan stood in the office of his lawyer, Patrick Reynolds, a trusted man who had worked for him for years. "I need you to find someone for me. Rachel Miller." Patrick frowned. "Miller is a very common last name, Ethan. Do you have any other information?" Ethan took a deep breath. "She lived in New York 10 years ago. I don't know what happened after that. But there's a boy, Lucas, who looks like he could be my son. I want to know everything, where she's been, what happened, and most importantly, why she disappeared from my life." Patrick noticed the gravity in his friend's voice and nodded. "I'll find out what I can." Ethan ran a hand down his face, impatient. Fast. On the other side of the city, Rachel was packing. She knew that her encounter with Ethan wouldn't end there. He had recognized her. And worse, he had seen Lucas. Her heart pounded. Her stomach twisted. Why had fate done this to her? She had spent years hiding, protecting her son from the truth, and now everything was about to collapse. Lucas appeared at the door of their small apartment. "Mom, what's going on?" Rachel forced a smile. "We're going on a trip, sweetheart." "Why?" She knelt in front of him and cupped his face. "Because it's better this way." Lucas frowned. "Is it because of that man? The guy in the car yesterday?" Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. "Why do you think that?" The boy shrugged. "Because you got scared when you saw him." Rachel swallowed hard. Lucas was smart. He always had been. "It's nothing, my love. I just need to keep you safe." Lucas narrowed his eyes. Safe from who? Rachel couldn't answer. But before she could say anything, there was a knock at the door. She froze. Her heart pounded in her chest. It couldn't be. Already? She stood up slowly and opened the door. Ethan Caldwell was there. Time stopped. Lucas looked at the man in front of him, then at his mother, feeling the weight of a silence filled with secrets. Rachel wanted to slam the door in his face, but Ethan didn't seem willing to let her run away again. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice deep but not aggressive. Rachel hesitated, then looked at Lucas. "Go to your room for a bit, sweetheart." Lucas crossed his arms. "But I want to know." "Lucas." The seriousness in his mother's tone made the boy back down. Huffing, he walked away. As soon as the bedroom door closed, Rachel turned to Ethan. "What do you want?" Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Seriously? After 10 years without an explanation, that's your first question?" Rachel crossed her arms, tense. "You don't understand." Ethan took a step forward, his expression intense. "Then make me understand." Rachel felt a wave of emotions: fear, anger, guilt. She closed her eyes and tried to stay calm. "Ethan, you need to leave." He frowned. "No. You owe me answers, Rachel. You disappeared without saying anything. And now I find out you have a son who looks exactly like me." Rachel felt a lump in her throat. "Don't do this." Ethan shook his head, exasperated. "Is Lucas my son?" Rachel remained silent. His eyes locked onto hers, searching for the truth. And then Rachel looked away. Ethan clenched his fists. "My God, he is, isn't he?" Rachel pressed her temples. "You don't understand." "Then make me understand." Ethan exploded. "I spent 10 years thinking you had just abandoned me. I looked for you, Rachel, and now I find out that maybe I have a son I never even knew existed." Rachel gritted her teeth. "Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I chose to leave?" Ethan took a step back, confused. "What are you saying?" Rachel bit her lower lip. Her chest rose and fell quickly. She didn't want to get into this. Not now. But Ethan wasn't going to give up. And then she dropped the bomb. "It was your mother." Ethan's face changed. "What?" "It was Margaret. She paid me to disappear. She said that if I didn't accept, she would destroy my life. She said that if you found out about my pregnancy, she would take my baby away from me." Ethan felt a shock course through his body. "That can't be true." Rachel let out a humorless laugh. "You know exactly what your mother is capable of." Ethan was speechless. The impact of her revelation hit him like a punch to the stomach. Rachel continued, her voice unsteady. "I wanted to tell you. I wanted you to know, but I couldn't risk losing my son." The silence between them grew heavy, and then, suddenly, a small voice came from the hallway. "Dad?" They both turned. Lucas stood there. His eyes were wide. Ethan felt a lump in his throat. He had heard everything. Rachel brought a hand to her mouth. Lucas looked at Ethan and asked again, "Are you my dad?" Ethan crouched down, bringing himself to the boy's level. His heart was racing. He swallowed hard, and with a trembling voice answered, "Yes, son, I'm your father." Lucas's expression became a mixture of shock, curiosity, and emotion, and in that moment, Ethan knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The silence in the apartment was suffocating. Lucas was still standing at the hallway door, eyes wide, trying to process the revelation he had just heard. Rachel couldn't breathe. Her worst fear had come true. Lucas had discovered the truth in the worst possible way. Ethan, kneeling in front of the boy, swallowed hard. "Yes, son, I am your father." Lucas blinked a few times, stunned. His small fists clenched at his sides. "Then, why did you never come to see me before?" The question hit Ethan like a punch. Rachel closed her eyes, feeling her heart tighten. Ethan hesitated for a second, then looked directly at Rachel, his voice tense. "Because I didn't know you existed." Lucas looked at his mother, confused and hurt. "Is that true?" Rachel felt her throat close up. How could she explain this? How could she tell him that she had spent years running away out of fear of losing her son? The boy's eyes shone with unshed tears. "Did you hide me from him?" Rachel knelt, holding her son's hands. "It wasn't like that, my love. I did what I thought was right to protect you." Lucas took a step back. "Protect me from what? He's my dad." The pain in the boy's voice made Rachel feel like her heart was shattering. Ethan saw the desperation on Rachel's face, but for the first time, he didn't back down. Lucas looked him up and down, still trying to understand everything. Then his expression hardened. "If you're my dad, why are you here now? Are you going to take me away?" Rachel's eyes widened. "No." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. "No, He paused, took a deep breath. "I just want to get to know you." Lucas said nothing. He simply turned and walked back into his room, closing the door behind him. The silence between Ethan and Rachel was deafening. "This wasn't supposed to happen like this," she whispered, her eyes full of tears. Ethan ran a hand over his face, exhausted. "But it did. And now? What do we do about it, Rachel?" She had no answer. But someone else already did. Margaret Caldwell's office was a reflection of her personality, luxurious, calculated, and cold. She was sitting in a leather chair, a glass of wine in her hand, as she watched Ethan standing in front of her. "So," she said, expressionless, "you finally found out." Ethan clenched his fists. "It was you." Margaret tilted her head slightly, sipping her wine as if they were discussing something trivial. "I had to protect you, Ethan. That relationship would never have gotten you anywhere." Rage flared in his chest like fire. "Protect? You destroyed my life. You hid my son from me." Margaret sighed, impatient. "Do you have any idea what kind of scandal this would have brought to our family, to our business? You were already a Caldwell, Ethan. I couldn't allow you to get involved with someone so beneath us." Ethan laughed, incredulous. "So you decided to play God with my life?" Margaret crossed her legs and placed the glass on the table. "Don't be dramatic." Ethan slammed his fist on the table, making her jump. "Lucas is my son, and you stole him from me." Margaret finally showed a real emotion. Disdain. "And what do you plan to do now? Take him away from the mother who raised him alone? He doesn't even know you, Ethan." Ethan's silence revealed his hesitation. Margaret smirked, satisfied. "You could take a DNA test, file a lawsuit, and drag that child into a legal battle. But ask yourself, will that make you a father?" Ethan took a deep breath. Margaret was right. He could legally get shared custody, but that wouldn't bring Lucas into his arms. It would only push him further away. "You've always manipulated my life, but this time you won't win." Margaret simply smirked. "We'll see." Ethan turned and walked out, determined to prove that he was no longer a boy under his mother's control. This time, he would do things the right way. And to do that, he needed to find Rachel. Rachel was sitting on her apartment couch, hugging her knees, when she heard the knock on the door. She knew it was him. Taking a deep breath, she opened it. Ethan was there, damp from the light drizzle, but his eyes were determined. "I'm not going to take Lucas from you." Rachel blinked, surprised. "What?" "I'm not going to fight legally. I don't want him to go through that. I don't want to be a stranger who suddenly appears and destroys his world." Rachel felt tears welling up in her eyes. Ethan took a step forward, his face close to hers. "But I want to be his father. I want to be present, and I'm going to do it the right way." Rachel's heart pounded. For years, she had lived in fear of the moment Ethan would discover the truth. She had never expected him to say this. Ethan continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to earn his trust. I want him to know me and, one day, call me Dad because he feels it, not because a judge told him to." Rachel bit her lip, tears streaming down her face. You really want this?" Ethan nodded. "More than anything." Rachel closed her eyes, overwhelmed with emotion, and for the first time in years, she felt that maybe she didn't have to run anymore. But there was still one more obstacle in their way, and it had a name. Ethan walked into the apartment and found Victoria waiting for him, arms crossed, a glass of wine in hand. "You were with her." Ethan sighed. "Let's not do this now, Victoria." She let out a dry laugh. "Have I been a fool all these years?" He looked at her, tired. "I never loved you, and you knew that." Pain flashed in Victoria's eyes, but she stayed firm. "So that's it? You're leaving me for her?" Ethan shook his head. "I'm not leaving you for her. I'm leaving you for me." Victoria clenched her teeth. "If you do this, my family will destroy you." Ethan smiled without humor. "I'd rather lose everything than live a lie." Victoria realized she had already lost. Ethan Caldwell had made his choice, and this time, no one was going to stop him. The air in Rachel's small apartment was heavy. The silence between her and Ethan was almost suffocating, but both of their eyes were fixed on the closed door of Lucas's room. He hasn't spoken to me since yesterday, Rachel said, crossing her arms. Her voice was low, tired. He only answers when necessary. He's angry. Ethan ran a hand over his face. I figured. Rachel glanced at him. Don't think he's just going to accept you overnight, Ethan. He spent his whole life without you. And now, all of a sudden, you show up and say you're his father. Ethan sighed. I never expected this to be easy. Rachel pressed her lips together. Are you really staying? Ethan turned to face her. What do you think? She lowered her head. I think part of me still doesn't believe it. Ethan took a small step closer. Rachel, I spent years of my life feeling like something was missing. Now I know what it was. I'm not leaving. Not ever again. Rachel closed her eyes for a moment. Part of her wanted to believe him, but another part, the one that had spent years protecting herself, was still afraid. Suddenly the bedroom door opened. Lucas walked out with his head down, his hair messy, but he didn't look at Ethan. I'm hungry. Rachel forced a smile. I'll make something. Lucas nodded and walked to the table. Ethan took the opportunity. Lucas. The boy stopped but didn't look at him. Can we talk? Lucas shrugged. Whatever. Rachel watched from a distance as Ethan took a deep breath and knelt beside his son's chair. I know you're mad at me. Lucas kept his eyes on his empty plate. I'm not mad. Yes, you are, and that's okay. You have every right to be. Lucas bit his lower lip but remained silent. Ethan swallowed hard and continued. I know I haven't been the father you deserved. I know I wasn't here when you needed me most. Lucas clenched his fists. You could have looked for me sooner. Ethan felt a sharp pain in his chest. I know, but I didn't know you existed, son. If I had known, I would have done everything to be here. Lucas finally looked at him. His eyes were shining with emotion. Do you swear? Ethan felt the weight of those words. He placed a hand over his heart. I swear. Lucas lowered his head again. Then prove it. Ethan blinked. What? Lucas finally lifted his gaze, staring directly at him. Everyone makes promises, but most people don't keep them. Ethan felt a lump in his throat. Rachel was also surprised by her son's response. He had always been mature for his age, but now he sounded like someone who had already learned not to trust easily. Ethan nodded. All right, I'll prove it to you. Lucas just gave a small nod, but Ethan knew this was a first step. Margaret gripped her wine glass so tightly it seemed like she might shatter it at any moment. So he really did it. Victoria, sitting on the couch, sipped her own wine with a bitter expression. He did, and he didn't back down. Margaret swirled the glass between her fingers. He's making a terrible mistake. Victoria let out a dry laugh. He's doing what he always wanted. But you never let him. Margaret finally looked at her, eyes narrowing. You sound relieved. Victoria sighed and placed her glass on the table. Because I am. You never cared about what I wanted. You just used me to keep Ethan under control. Margaret leaned back in her chair. You shouldn't give up so easily. There's still time to bring him back. Victoria shook her head. You don't understand, Margaret. This time he's really gone. Margaret clenched her jaw, her teeth grinding. Then he's going to pay for it. The wind blew strong through Central Park. Ethan stood nervously next to a wooden bench, waiting. Rachel and Lucas were on their way. He didn't know why he was so anxious. Maybe because this was his one chance to truly connect with his son. When he saw Rachel and Lucas approaching, his stomach twisted. Lucas was serious, but he was coming, and that was already a victory. Rachel stopped beside her son. I'll be back in an hour. Lucas nodded. Ethan looked at Rachel with gratitude. Thank you. She just nodded and walked away. Lucas crossed his arms. So? Ethan smiled. So. They stood in silence for a few seconds. Then Ethan held out a ticket to Lucas. How about a Yankees game? Lucas narrowed his eyes. You like baseball? Ethan grinned. I do now. Lucas took the ticket and looked at it for a moment. Then, for the first time, he smiled a little. All right, but if I go, you have to buy me a giant hot dog. Ethan laughed. Deal. And in that moment, he knew he was starting to rebuild something real. The first steps had been taken, but Margaret wasn't going to accept defeat. She still had one last card to play. And Ethan and Rachel would have to face one final challenge before they could finally become a real family. Margaret Caldwell never accepted losing. Her entire life, she had moved the pieces on the board to ensure everything happened exactly as she wanted. And now, watching Ethan walk away, Choosing Rachel and a bastard child over the Caldwell family was simply unacceptable. That's why, when she contacted Rachel that morning, she knew exactly what to say. "I hope you're enjoying your days with Ethan," Margaret said, her voice cold. Rachel took a deep breath. "What do you want, Margaret?" On the other end of the line, Margaret smiled slightly. "I want to give you a choice." Rachel narrowed her eyes. "What kind of choice?" "You know Ethan is a Caldwell. He belongs to this world. The question is, do you?" Rachel felt anger rising through her body. "You still think you can decide his life?" Margaret ignored the comment. "I can ensure that you and Lucas never have to worry about money again. I can provide a house far from New York, a comfortable life. In exchange, you leave and never see Ethan again." Rachel felt her blood run cold. "You're unbelievable." "I'm practical." Rachel clenched her teeth. "There's no amount of money in the world that would make me take Lucas away from his father." Margaret sighed. "I knew you'd say that, but I thought I should ask." The call ended. Rachel closed her eyes. This wasn't over, and she needed to tell Ethan. Ethan listened as Rachel told him about Margaret's proposal, and his chest grew heavy with anger. "She's never going to stop, is she?" he murmured, rubbing his face. Rachel placed a hand on his arm. "She'll only stop when you prove she can't manipulate you anymore." Ethan took a deep breath. Then he picked up his phone and dialed a number. "What are you doing?" Rachel asked. Ethan looked at her, determined. "Ending this." Minutes later, Ethan stood in his mother's office, facing her without fear for the first time in his life. Margaret slowly stood from her chair. "What is it, dear? Have you come to apologize?" Ethan laughed without humor. "I came to tell you that you lost." Margaret's face twisted for a second, but she quickly regained her composure. "Don't be ridiculous." Ethan took a step forward. "This time I choose. I choose my son. I choose Rachel. And I choose a life without you controlling me." Margaret crossed her arms. "Do you really think you can live without me?" Ethan stepped even closer, his gaze cold. "That's exactly what I realized." For the first time, Margaret showed something Ethan had never seen before. Fear. She knew she had lost control. Ethan turned and walked out without looking back. This time, he was free. The Yankees were playing against the Red Sox that night, but Ethan could barely focus on the field. He kept glancing at Lucas beside him, cheering excitedly. This was their second game together, and Ethan could feel his son starting to open up more. But something was still missing. Lucas put down his hot dog and suddenly looked at Ethan. "Are you staying for good?" Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "Of course." Lucas stared at the field. "Even if it takes a long time for us to really get to know each other." Ethan leaned forward. "Lucas, no matter how long it takes, I'll be here. Always." Lucas was silent for a few moments. Then he gave a small smile. "Good." Ethan felt a tightness in his chest. Lucas trusted him. It was a start. Rachel was pouring coffee in the kitchen while Lucas finished his homework. Ethan's phone rang, and he answered without checking the number. "Hello?" Margaret's voice came through, cold as ever. "Ethan." He closed his eyes. "What do you want?" "You made your choice." He waited, but she said nothing else. "Yes, I did." There was silence. Then Margaret simply hung up. Ethan stared at his phone for a few seconds. Rachel approached. "What is it?" He let out a long sigh. She gave up. Rachel's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" Ethan smiled. "For the first time in my life, yes." Rachel smiled too, but before she could say anything, Lucas appeared beside them. "Hey guys?" They looked at him. Lucas scratched his head, looking a bit shy. "I was thinking, can we have dinner together? Like, as a family?" Rachel looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Rachel. A smile spread across both of their faces. "I think we can do that," Rachel said, wrapping an arm around her son. Ethan placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "And next time, you pick the restaurant." Lucas grinned. Rachel watched them, and for the first time, she felt no fear. They had lost too much time, but now they were making up for every second. Together, autumn was giving way to winter, and a cold breeze cut through the air in New York. Ethan and Lucas walked side by side through the park, their steps slow and steady as dry leaves crunched beneath their feet. Lucas, hands in the pockets of his hoodie, kicked a small rock, lost in thought. Ethan noticed and smiled. "What are you thinking about?" Lucas hesitated for a second. "Do you think people deserve second chances?" The question took Ethan by surprise. He shoved his hands into his coat pockets and looked ahead, taking a deep breath. It depends. Lucas raised an eyebrow. On what? Ethan stopped walking for a moment, leaning against a wooden bench. He looked at the trees around them, most of them already bare, and felt the metaphor in it. Life was full of cycles. It depends on what they do with that second chance. He finally answered. Lucas studied him for a moment, as if processing every word. And you? What? Do you think you're doing a good job with yours? Ethan smiled, feeling an unexpected warmth in his chest. I'm trying. Lucas let out a small sigh and kicked the rock again. I think you're doing okay. Ethan felt his heart tighten. It was the first time Lucas had said something like that. Thanks, son. Lucas frowned slightly and bit his lower lip. You know, when I was younger, I used to make up stories about my dad. Ethan froze. Stories? Lucas nodded. I'd hear my friends talking about their dads, and I didn't want to feel different. So I made up stories that my dad was an astronaut or a secret agent. One time I even said he owned a pizzeria and that I got to eat pizza for free every day. Ethan chuckled. That last one would have been nice. Lucas laughed too, but then his face grew serious. But deep down, I just wanted him to be real. Ethan took a deep breath and ran a hand through his son's hair, messing it up slightly. I'm so sorry, Lucas. The boy just shrugged. But now you're here. Ethan felt a lump in his throat. Lucas looked at him, then suddenly held out his hand. Want to play basketball with me tomorrow? Ethan blinked. It was a small gesture, but for Lucas, it was an invitation to something much bigger. Ethan smiled and shook his son's hand. I'd love to. They continued walking through the park, side by side. But this time, the silence between them wasn't uncertain. It was the comfort of something new, something still being built. And for the first time, Ethan Caldwell was absolutely certain of one thing. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. He was already Lucas's father, and he always would be. Did you like the story? If this story moved you, share it with someone you love. After all, it's never too late to rebuild a family.